I used to lie to yoga teachers about something. I told this lie a lot. In the first years of my practice, I never would admit that I was uncomfortable being touched, but I was. In Shavasana, corpse pose, instead of relaxing when a well-intentioned teacher would touch my face or forehead, I wanted to get up and run out of the room. I wanted to hide. I wanted it to stop. It wasn't relaxing. Up until that point in my life, almost all of the physical contact I'd had with other humans was either in the context of sex or violence. It wasn't until just a few years ago, and I'm 54 now, that I became familiar and comfortable with other forms of physical contact, like the kind that was standard in yoga classes when I began my practice almost 30 years ago. I wasn't proud of this, so when teachers would ask if I was okay getting touched, I would say that I was. I would lie. I didn't want anybody to think that I was damaged. I didn't want people to wonder what was wrong with me. However, as a student, I have learned a lot and been helped tremendously by the many ways that teachers have physically, through touch, shifted, supported, and educated me in my asana practice. The things that stand out for me in my personal history with hands-on assistance are things like learning what it feels like to lengthen the spine in downward-facing dog, or to fold more deeply in a forward bend, both things that developed my skill in movement and helped increase the optimal functionality of my body. But I, like many people who practice asana, have also been hurt while getting hands-on adjustments. It only happened to me once, and it wasn't as bad as some of the horror stories I've heard. I was lucky to heal fairly quickly. It happened with a teacher who'd never met me before, who pushed me past the place my body was ready to go. This teacher, and many who injure students similarly, probably had the best of intentions. But no matter how sensitive and skilled a teacher is, they can't feel what the student is feeling. And even the student may not know that they're about to be taken too far. When I got injured, I didn't hurt until it was too late. Now, when I began teaching, it was all but required to physically adjust and assist students. It was part of what we did. And it was all taught from the physical perspective. I can't recall ever being asked in the trainings I took whether I was okay with touching other people. Rather, I was told how to do it. I also don't recall any discussion about obtaining consent from students. And that might be because at that time, in the 1990s, it seemed that students almost universally wanted to be physically assisted. There was a big Yoga Journal survey of practitioners around that time that revealed that individual physical attention was the number one thing that students wanted from teachers. At the studio where I taught, teachers were encouraged to try to physically assist each student at least once per class. So since sun salutes were part of most of my classes, I would take the time that we spent holding downward facing dog to, student by student and row by row, adjust everybody, pressing or pulling their hips away from their hands. And I thought I was doing my job. I thought it was what they wanted. And now, in the current Me Too era, where the yoga world has been rocked by scandal after scandal about sexual impropriety on the part of almost always male yoga teachers, there's a lot of talk about whether or not to touch students and whether and how to obtain consent. It's worth noting that the uproar is coming mostly from teachers of yoga. It does not seem that we're hearing so much discontent around this from students, but that doesn't make it any less true or important or relevant. So this week's podcast is about physical contact between teachers of asana and their students. This is the My Yoga Practice podcast. I'm James Brown. I've been teaching yoga practice and how to teach it to people all over the world for over 20 years. In this podcast, I intend to share with you the most important things about teaching that I've learned along the way. Yoga practice is to be tailored to the individual, yet it tends to be taught with a one-size-fits-all approach to people with different needs and abilities. In this podcast series, learn specific teaching strategies that allow each student in your class to make the practice their own. In preparation for this podcast, I posted a request on social media for input from teachers and students. Since it's been so long since I originally learned about hands-on modalities of teaching, and because so much has changed in the world since then, and because I don't really teach much anymore, I wanted to know what others thought. I was surprised to learn that many teachers now don't touch their students at all, and that many more do so very little. Some of those who don't touch or who touch very little say that they've always had that policy, but many adapted it based on the fact that we don't know the personal physical and emotional histories of students, and that we therefore can't know if our touch might be injurious, unwelcome, or traumatizing. Further, in the past couple of years, there's been a downsizing of the scope of expertise that's expected from a yoga teacher. We now know something that wasn't readily acknowledged 20 years ago. That is that we are not physical therapists. We're not trained in physical therapy, and we're not expected to be. I recall in an early teacher training I was teaching, I made the statement I always do when I'm teaching prospective teachers about dealing with students who come to class with injuries and special conditions. That is to remember that you are not a doctor. Except that in this training, one of the students was actually a medical doctor. And even she said that the yoga room, no matter how qualified she is as a doctor, is not a place to diagnose and treat perceived weaknesses and problems in the body. In truth, almost no yoga teachers are skilled enough to just go around a room reshaping bodies that they don't know. If it's true that even in professions that have the greatest skill with anatomy and the most education with it, like that doctor student so long ago, if they wouldn't do that, why should we? One of the points made by many teachers who responded to my query on social media, who were voicing support for physical touch in yoga classes, was that we live in a world where people get touched much less than they probably need to be. And while that may be true, it begs the question, is a yoga class the place to fix that? I mean, you wouldn't expect your doctor to hug you, would you? Sure, there are probably some doctors that get a little huggy, but it is surely rare and is not expected. What makes yoga class any different? What makes us think we need to touch people? Like so many things that yoga teachers have been doing, I think we've been doing it because we thought we were supposed to. We did it because our teachers did it. But things are changing. In an earlier podcast this season, I talked about using the concept of desired outcomes to illuminate the many choices that a teacher makes about each moment of teaching. When developing teaching strategies before class and in the moment that it's happening, consider what do you want the outcome to be. Considering your desired outcome has proven, for me, to be an invaluable step in choosing whether, when, and how to touch a student. Begin your examination of desired teaching outcomes with regard to using physical contact in teaching by asking yourself, why do you want to do it? There are plenty of bad reasons to touch a student, obvious ones like to get your jollies, to exercise what you perceive as power over them, to show them who's boss. A more common but injurious message that you might be sending to students when you use touch to teach is that they need fixing, that you're not satisfied with how they are, that you want them to look like a picture. Yoga asana practice is about the quality of physical work and the quality of the mind when doing it. It's not about getting to a particular shape. The poses themselves, my teacher Mati would often say, are meaningless. I also personally find it inappropriate to touch students to make them feel loved, cared for, or included. While I do feel a great deal of love for my students, I just don't think that it's appropriate for me to show them by touching them. I show them by teaching them, and I usually teach without touching. As a teacher, I don't give a lot of hands-on adjustments or assists. I never have. At first, it was because I wasn't skilled at it. Then I got more skilled because I was basically forced to learn, but even then I wasn't comfortable with it. Now I am skilled and comfortable with it, but still, I don't give a lot of hands-on adjustments. And here's why. I believe that my job as an asana teacher is to verbally articulate how to do the practice. My job is to work to find words that get the student to do the work of the practice. When words seem to fail, instead of physically manipulating the student, instead of physically imposing my agenda on them, my first go-to is to try different words. But there are times that words don't work, And at those times, I might try a demonstration, either one that I do or ideally that another student that I know well does. And sometimes I do use my hands on the student to get the desired outcome. There are three main kinds of touch that I do find to be sometimes useful and sometimes appropriate. The first one, and it's the one that I use the least, is when my desired outcome is to physically change the shape of the pose using my own power. Those adjustments I mentioned earlier, lengthening the spine in downward facing dog, or helping to deepen a forward bend, are examples of this. When I do this type of adjustment, and I don't do it a lot, it's so that the student knows what it feels like to have it happen. When I do it, and again, I don't do it a lot, I begin and end slowly so that the student can try to hold things where I put them on their own. So they get the experience of feeling it happen with my help, then doing it on their own, so they know that they can and they know how to do it. Do not remove the work for them. In experiences of challenge, we learn so much about ourselves. A good assist from a teacher can help a student deepen a forward bend or do a wrap in a twist, but when you're taking a person past the range of motion that they can get to themselves, you're entering risky territory with regard to potential injury. It's much easier for you to injure a student than for them to injure themselves. So proceed carefully and sensitively. This type of adjustment can help a student break through old patterns and can help them open up their body in ways that they've not ever found on their own. So it might be worth the effort to learn skillful assists in this way, but know that it can be risky for a number of reasons. Consider, what are you trying to do for the student? Are you helping them chart new territory in a safe way, or are you taking their work away from them so that it's easier? And if so, should you be making it easier? Does easy yoga practice work? The answers to these questions might be different for everybody, but avoid automatically assisting. Give help when it truly helps, and do it carefully. Remember, you're there to help your students practice. That will mean adjusting in some cases and not adjusting in others. The only time that I do physically shift the body where I actually want to be the one doing the work is if I'm teaching a restoratives class, which I used to do a lot. And in those cases, I want to bring the body sometimes into a position when there is likely to be greater ease and comfort. I want to take the work away from them. Many times in those situations, I don't want the students to have to process language into action. I just want them to be comfortable. So sometimes, if I see an opportunity to make the pose work better for them, I do it for them. I use this kind of teaching modality rarely. It can definitely happen too much. I practiced Ashtanga Vinyasa for many years, and in that system there are usually several teaching assistants running around the room doing physical adjustments and assists to the practitioners in the room. There are some poses that always seem to get an adjustment. There was one, Prasarita Padottanasana C, which is a standing wide leg forward bend where you have the hands clasped with straight elbows behind the back with the fingers interlaced. You fold forward from the hips and then try to take the arms clasped behind you, overhead, and toward the floor. Very few people can get their hands to the floor. And that and the architecture of the pose make it an easy and attractive one for teachers to give a student some help with. So I would almost always get my arms pushed toward the floor from a well-intentioned yoga teacher. And I realized one day that I was not able to go very far without their help, and that was because I was always getting help. I didn't learn this until I was practicing on my own. In order to increase range of motion there, I needed to vigorously engage the posterior deltoid, the muscle in the back of the shoulder. Through all of those years of getting assistance in that pose, I didn't learn that. And once I did, it changed a lot about my practice. That understanding of how to engage the posterior deltoid to move into greater shoulder extension helps me a lot with other poses, like many back bends and with shoulder stand. And I never would have learned that if I kept getting assisted every time I did it. Another way that I use physical touch when teaching, and I use this one much more often, is when the desired outcome is to guide the student. I'll use my hands to help them steer their efforts in a particular way. For example, touching 2 points and asking them to try to bring them closer together or further apart, or touching something that could be more relaxed or more engaged, touching the inner arch of the foot in as non-ticklish a way as possible to ask them to lift them. And although I do this more than the previous modality I mentioned, where I actually do the work, I don't do this one a lot either because the words usually work. And the third and final way that I use my hands to work with a student is the one that's most obviously necessary and that I will never stop using. That's when my desired outcome is to stabilize a person who needs it, which is most frequently done when the student is coming into something like an inversion, going upside down. Learning to take the body upside down has some risk to it, but in my opinion, it's worth learning for many reasons. And this is a time that I think it's okay for the teacher to do a lot of the work because students often bring a lot of fear and insecurity into their first experiences of these. So I want them to know what it feels like to be there. I want to support them for as long as they want my support. I want to be like training wheels for them in the case of inversions so that they learn to do it on their own safely and with confidence. So those are the 3 examples of the times that I use physical contact to reach a desired teaching outcome. To change the shape, which is done rarely, to teach the effort, which is done sometimes, or to stabilize and support, which is done whenever needed. There are also some specific examples of undesirable outcomes, times that I recommend against using physical contact in teaching. First, I've witnessed a lot of codependent relationships between teachers and students over the years, and physical touch is one of the ways that those codependencies are fostered and nurtured. There are students who seek adjustments, who feel like the teacher is ignoring them if they don't touch them. And there are plenty of teachers who are more than willing to satisfy that need for touch. From the very beginning, my teacher Mati taught me that rather than being a practice of codependence, yoga is a practice of independence. Of course, our students come to us with many needs. The only need that we should be satisfying is their need to know how to do a yoga practice. You are doing the students a disservice when you give them the idea that they need you. The methodology that Mati taught me, by example, was to teach a practice that eventually resulted in the student being able to practice completely independent of you. Don't make them think they need you. That is not fair. It's not yoga practice. It's codependence, and it's harmful. Another undesirable instance of using physical contact to teach is when it's done to mask a lack of understanding about a pose. If you can't articulate it, should you be teaching it? My answer is no. In order to teach an asana well, you need to know far more about it than is required to articulate it well. If you can't say it well, don't teach it. And certainly, please, don't go putting your hands on somebody to teach them something that you don't understand well enough to articulate. As I said earlier, when I was first learning to teach, obtaining informed consent from a student before touching them was not nearly the front burner issue that it is today. But we know a lot more today than we did then. Your students each have unique levels of receptivity to and unique responses to touch. A moment ago, I talked about the student who seeks touch. They're fairly easy to spot. But it's a lot harder to see and understand the other end of the spectrum, somebody who, like me when I first started practicing, doesn't want to be touched. When I asked for input on social media about this topic, many of the responses discussed the need for informed consent and the reasons that a person may not want touch. Those things are being pretty well articulated in the current discussions around this topic in the yoga world. Something I want to bring more to the front is this. When you ask somebody if it's okay to touch them, you don't always get an honest answer. You need to know that when you make your decisions about touching. I talked earlier about my own struggles with it, but I've never heard this point made as well as it was made by Jay Pizarro, who teaches yoga for combat veterans and is a combat veteran himself. And here's what he said. He said, I endured several male and female yoga teachers and their assistants trespass my personal space boundaries and lay their hands on various parts of my body to cause alignments where they thought I should correct my posture. Some even touched my face and forehead while I was zoned out in Shavasana. What all these teachers didn't know is that I have combat-connected post-traumatic stress disorder, and one of its key symptoms is loss of self-agency due to overwhelming external force. They had no way of knowing this, just as they would not know if any of their students had rape-connected trauma. While the teachers and assistants were well-intentioned, their touch triggered many episodes of, in my case, combat trauma, as in being attacked silently while I was off guard. Or, as it may be similar to victims of sexual trauma, as sexual trauma victims also have lost their personal safety and self-agency due to an overwhelming external force. He continues, as a yoga teacher specialized in work with trauma, I came to realize that few students will spontaneously confide their trauma to a new yoga teacher. That's because doing this makes them feel broken or damaged. In consideration of these concerns, plus others, such as the unique individuality of anatomy and the arbitrariness of external alignment standards, my yoga protocol does not support touching of students, even and including with their permission, as permissions may be granted just to not draw other students' attention. While I fully acknowledge that many forms of contemporary yoga are divorced from its ancient philosophical genesis, and that's okay, for myself and my students, I chose to uphold the precept of ahimsa. And since I will not know when my touch may hurt, I opt to not touch. I want to thank Jay for contributing that. You can find a link to him and the work that he does on the episode page for this podcast on the website. But what he reveals is that asking does not always yield an honest answer, and my experience supports that. Jay chooses not to use any touch in his teaching. I do use it in mine, but not often, and when I do, I try to be super sensitive to the way the body responds. If the student has been unable to tell me, for whatever reason, not to touch them, I like to think that I'm sensitive enough to feel it in their body, and when I feel that, and I have, I gently retreat. Ideally, any teacher who is about to make an adjustment is sensitive enough to the student's nonverbal cues and can tell whether or not they'd appreciate hands-on help. Before they touch, they're near them. In a few seconds, you should be able to tell how your proximity to them is being received simply by being attuned to them. If you can't tell whether or not your contact is welcome, you probably aren't ready to adjust them. Give yourself time to develop that sensitivity if you intend to touch students. It comes from your practice and from experience teaching, and there's no rush. So this whole issue with touching and obtaining consent, to be completely honest, I don't know the best way to do this. I don't know if anybody does yet. Maybe the best way is to avoid touch completely when teaching. But I do think that as we figure this out, it is best to err on the side of clearly ascertaining consent. Before it might happen, and each time that it happens, is it okay that I do this? There are students who say that having a teacher ask makes it kind of weird for them. It makes them seem less confident. It makes it awkward. And while that may be true, I believe that we, as teachers, need to ask. Maybe you've decided not to use physical contact at all when you teach. Maybe that is the best way. But if you do choose to use physical contact in teaching, here are some recommendations. Use language first. If that doesn't work, try a demo. If you teach students with clarity how to prepare for, come into, work at, and come out of the tapas point, which was covered in the previous episode of this podcast, touching your students becomes much less necessary. I know this from experience. Seek wholehearted consent, but know that even with consent, touch may not be welcome and it may cause damage. If you're not sensitive enough to feel whether the touch is mentally and physically welcome, don't do it. Although most people love getting hands-on adjustments, some people do not. Close touch can be confrontational or emotionally challenging for some people, or it can seem inappropriate, even when done skillfully. Unless you know a student well, you probably are totally unaware of their relationship and experience with touch. Asking, like anything, can be done in a way that feels good, or it can make an awkward situation even more awkward. Don't make a big deal of it. If you want to ask, do so without drama. And while most of what we teach is transmitted verbally, the actual learning more likely takes place in the context of an asana practice through what the student feels when they follow your instructions. Oftentimes, it's appropriate to enhance the kinesthetic experience of asana with hands-on adjustments. Touch is an extremely powerful mode of communication and transference of energy. Use it wisely. There are benefits to the practitioner that simply can't be given in any other way sometimes. The flip side of the power of adjustment to help is that they can also harm or misguide as potently as they can do good. And some teachers are naturally gifted at assisting with touch, and for some it takes some time to become skilled, like it did with me. Still, others may never become comfortable with hands-on adjustments, and that's okay. Because of the power of touch, it is important to only do it if you are comfortable and skilled with it. If you're going to touch students, first learn some basic adjustments from a good teacher or mentor. What you do later in your teaching career will go better if you have a solid foundation in the safe and helpful adjustments that you've learned from a skilled and experienced practitioner. And above all, keep it about teaching. That is your job as a teacher. You can get a link to learn more about the work that Jay Pizarro does with combat veterans on the podcast page at myogapractice.com. There you can also access resources for teachers and practitioners of modern postural yoga, including over 100 video lessons that exist to help teachers teach yoga better. And you can also learn about and book private long-distance mentorship sessions for teachers with me. Please rate, review, subscribe to, and share the My Yoga Practice podcast. Thank you for listening.